They slapped me with a $4,200 fine for my rescue dogs barking, then attempted to seize my house when I couldn't pay. What they didn't realize, I'd just inherited my grandfather's underground mineral fortune worth $2.8 million. Thud. That's the sound those seizure documents made when they landed on my marble kitchen counter at 5:30 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. The same counter where I'd been feeding Luna her breakfast every day for 9 months, watching her gradually overcome the trauma that caused her barking initially. Here's the thing about bullies wielding authority. They always miscalculate the strength of the quiet ones. And Margaret Caldwell definitely miscalculated me. Before I explain how I transformed their entire development into a canine rescue sanctuary, where that same HOA chairwoman now performs court-mandated community service, cleaning up after 52 rescue dogs, drop a comment below. What would you do if some power-drunk HOA board tried to steal your home over your pet? And while you're considering that revenge scenario, tell me your location. I want to know if this HOA nightmare is plaguing communities everywhere or just here in Arizona. My name is Emma. I'm 32, and 9 months ago I believed I'd discovered my perfect suburban haven in Copper Ridge Estates. Recent divorce, fresh position as a cybersecurity analyst, and this wonderful chocolate Labrador named Luna, who I'd rescued from the county shelter. The poor girl had abandonment anxiety so severe she'd tremble when I reached for my keys. Copper Ridge appeared flawless on paper. 53 identical luxury homes constructed in 2020, each valued around $450,000. Complete with an HOA promising exclusive lifestyle management for merely $350 monthly. The aroma of fresh bark mulch and synthetic lawn chemicals hit you immediately upon driving through those elaborate stone entrance gates. Every morning at 5:45 a.m. precisely, you'd hear the chorus of matching sprinkler systems activating like synchronized clockwork. That's where I encountered Margaret Caldwell, 55 years old, HOA board chairwoman for 4 consecutive years, residing in the largest house on the prime corner lot like some suburban monarch. She'd taken early retirement from her position as loan officer and spent her days measuring grass heights with an actual measuring tape. I'm completely serious. She walked her 2 excessively groomed standard poodles named Princess and Duke. These dogs were so rigorously trained, they probably requested permission before wagging their tails. The first time Margaret knocked on my door, Luna had been barking for perhaps 30 minutes while I made a quick grocery run. Nothing excessive, just typical anxious dog behavior. But there she stood at 6:30 p.m. sharp, clipboard ready, wearing enough jasmine perfume mixed with aerosol hairspray to suffocate a small animal. Some of us have worked diligently to preserve property standards here, she declared, handing me a noise violation notice complete with time-stamped photographs she'd apparently captured from her window. The condescension oozed from every syllable like that cloying perfume. I attempted to explain Luna's anxiety issues, how we were collaborating with a trainer, how she was improving weekly. Margaret simply smiled, that razor-thin smile, and clicked, her pen against her clipboard. Regulations are regulations, sweetie. We must all make accommodizes for the collective benefit. Week 1, written warning. Week 2, Luna barked during a hailstorm. Second violation. Week 3, $750 fine for repeated offense. I discovered later that Margaret had been documenting everything with a decibel meter application, like she was constructing a criminal case against a 2-year-old rescue dog. Meanwhile, the entire neighborhood was walking on eggshells. Steve, the retired paramedic next door, would give me these apologetic glances over the fence. He'd whisper stories about how Margaret once fined him $300 for displaying his military flag 3 inches too low. Rebecca, the single mother across the street, had been concealing her decorative garden statues in the garage ever since Margaret declared them unauthorized aesthetic elements. There was even a secret messaging group called Copper Ridge Underground, where neighbors would alert each other when Margaret was conducting her rounds with that infernal clipboard. But here's what I didn't know yet. And what Margaret certainly didn't know was that my grandfather had recently passed away 4 months earlier. Grandpa Frank was an old-school petroleum prospector who'd struck it rich in the Texas oil fields decades ago. The attorneys were still processing his estate, but he'd left me something that would alter everything. Mineral rights worth $2.8 million all, Those nights I spent at 1:30 a.m. drinking bitter coffee and researching HOA regulations online, trying to figure out how to combat Margaret's power trip. I had no idea I was sitting on a fortune that would allow me to purchase and control her entire neighborhood. Luna could sense my stress. Her anxiety was improving with all the additional attention, but she'd still whimper when she heard Margaret's heels clicking down the pavement. Those shoes announced her presence like a warning siren, and half the dogs in the development would start barking before she even came into sight. Looking back, I think that's when I realized this wasn't just about one bitter HOA chairwoman with excessive free time. This was about people who weaponized minor authority to make others miserable. Sometimes the universe provides exactly the right tools to fight back. Margaret wasn't finished with me, not remotely. 3 weeks after that $750 fine, I'm walking Luna around the block when I notice something new aimed directly at my backyard. Professional-grade acoustic monitoring equipment mounted on Margaret's fence like she's operating a surveillance center. This wasn't some smartphone application anymore. This device looked like it belonged at a factory construction site, but that was only the beginning. The following morning, I find a municipal code enforcement officer at my door, clipboard in hand, examining my yard like he's expecting to discover an illegal kennel operation. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about a commercial dog breeding facility at this address." I nearly spit out my coffee. "Commercial breeding? I have one dog." He shrugged. "Just following up on the report. Mind if I examine the premises?" While he's inspecting my perfectly normal backyard, one dog, one water dish, one chew toy, I'm receiving notifications on my phone. Margaret's been active on the neighborhood social media group posting about property value destruction and residents who don't respect community standards. The comment section became a war zone, with Margaret's supporters discussing certain people who don't belong in a respectable neighborhood like this. The taste of that bitter 1:30 a.m. coffee is permanently burned into my memory from all those nights I spent researching HOA bylaws online. Margaret was betting I'd simply surrender and pay the fines. What she didn't anticipate was my cybersecurity. Analyst brain switching into problem-solving mode. First discovery: Margaret was overstepping her authority. The HOA bylaws clearly specified that fines exceeding $150 required a full board vote, not just the chairwoman's decision. She'd been operating unilaterally on all my violations, so I did what any rational person would do. I installed my own security cameras, completely legal, all focused on my own property, but with perfect views of the common areas where Margaret liked to patrol. That's when I captured my first breakthrough. Remember Princess and Duke? Margaret's perfectly behaved poodles? Turns out they're only perfect when Margaret's present to micromanage them. Every Tuesday at 1:30 p.m. sharp, Margaret drives to her weekly book club across town. The moment her car vanishes around the corner, those well-trained dogs transform into howling sirens. 53 minutes of continuous barking. I timed it precisely. My phone's audio recorder captured every bark, whine, and howl while I sat on my back deck with Luna, who was looking at me like, "Are you seriously going to let them get away with that?" The satisfying sound of that recording, app activating, was like a symphony to my ears. But here's where it becomes interesting. While I'm building my case against Margaret's hypocrisy, Steve leans over the fence and shares some neighborhood intelligence. "She hit me with a $300 fine last year," he whispers, glancing around like Margaret might materialize from thin air. "My military flag was displayed 3 inches too low. She measured it herself with a tape measure." Rebecca joins us at the fence, checking both directions before speaking. "I've been hiding my garden statues in the garage for 8 months. She said they violated the architectural cohesion standards." That's when Steve reveals his phone and shows me something beautiful. The Copper Ridge Underground messaging group. 28 neighbors all sharing Margaret horror stories and warning each other when she's making her rounds. "Mrs. Anderson from the cul-de-sac got fined for her rose bushes being the wrong shade of red," Rebecca whispers. Apparently they conflict with the approved color scheme. I'm observing these decent people all tiptoeing around their own neighborhood like they're living under some kind of totalitarian regime. And something clicks. This isn't just about Luna's barking anymore. This is about a bully who's been terrorizing an entire community one absurd fine at a time. So I made my first tactical move. I started documenting everything. Every interaction, every violation notice, every suspicious activity gets logged in a spreadsheet with timestamps and photographic evidence. My cybersecurity background proved invaluable. I constructed a database that would make a federal investigator weep with joy. Then I discovered Margaret's first real weakness. While researching property law in case things escalated, I stumbled across something fascinating in the county records. Margaret had been filing complaints about other neighbors, too. Lots of other neighbors. Single women primarily. Several elderly residents. One family with teenage children who played basketball in their driveway, starting to see a pattern here. But the real revelation came when I cross-referenced her complaint history with actual violations. Margaret had been fabricating infractions. Garden statues aren't mentioned anywhere in the HOA bylaws. Neither are flag display requirements or rosebush color restrictions. Here's your first knowledge nugget. HOA board members can be held personally liable for exceeding their authority. Always demand they cite specific bylaw sections in writing. Most bullies collapse when you force them to show their work. Luna was gaining confidence daily, her tail wagging like a metronome against my legs whenever we walked past Margaret's house. She could sense the shift in my energy from victim to strategist. Honestly, I was starting to enjoy this chess match. Margaret escalated dramatically. The next violation notice wasn't $750. It was $2,100 for continued violations, despite the fact that Luna hadn't had a single barking incident in over 3 weeks. The letter came with a delightful little threat. Pay within 30 days or face foreclosure. Proceedings. Foreclosure over a dog that wasn't even barking anymore, but Margaret wasn't done flexing her authority. 2 days later, I receive an elegant legal envelope from Caldwell & Associates. Turns out her husband Richard is an attorney. The cease and desist letter was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, demanding I remove my security cameras because they were violating neighborhood privacy expectations. The irony wasn't lost on me. Miss Acoustic Monitor, pointed at my yard, was lecturing me about privacy. That's when I decided to conduct some investigation of my own. You'd be amazed what you can discover in public records when you know where to look. First stop, the courthouse basement, which smells like moldy paper and shattered dreams. 4 hours of searching through files, and I struck gold. Richard Caldwell isn't just Margaret's husband. He's the city zoning commissioner, the same commission that approves HOA enforcement actions, the same commission that rubber stamps code violation complaints. Conflict of interest much? But wait, there's more. Margaret's violation history as HOA chairwoman makes for fascinating reading. In 4 years, she's filed 312 complaints against residents. Compare that to the previous chairwoman who filed maybe 40 total. Margaret's been industrious. Then I made a simple request that every homeowner should know about. I demanded a complete HOA financial audit. By law, they must provide it within 30 days. When those books arrived, I felt like a detective who'd just cracked the case wide open. $63,000 in unexplained administrative fees. That's substantial missing money for a 53-house development. The landscaping contract alone was suspicious. $9,500 monthly for basic lawn maintenance, with no competitive bidding process. One internet search later, I discovered that Caldwell Landscaping is owned by Margaret's brother-in-law. My cybersecurity skills proved invaluable here. I built a database tracking every expense, every vendor, every payment authorization. The digital trail was like following breadcrumbs, except these breadcrumbs led to a cookie jar with Margaret's hands stuck inside. Kickbacks, inflated invoices, family business deals with no oversight. Margaret had transformed the HOA into her personal piggy bank. But the revelation that really got my blood pumping: Margaret called animal control on Luna, claiming she was aggressive and uncontrolled. Officer Martinez shows up at my door, takes one look at Luna, who's currently trying to lick his boots off, and starts laughing. "Ma'am, I've seen aggressive dogs. This girl would apologize for wagging her tail too enthusiastically." He spent 15 minutes playing fetch with Luna in my backyard, then turned to me with a knowing look. "We get numerous calls from that address," he said, nodding toward Margaret's house. "Usually they're about as accurate as this one." That evening, the Copper Ridge Underground messaging group was buzzing. Steve had news. "Did some research on our dear chairwoman," he texted. "Used to work at Regional Trust Bank, left under questionable circumstances 4 years ago. Rebecca's ex-husband, Mike, an investigative journalist, had been making inquiries. Turns out Margaret was asked to resign from the bank for irregular lending practices. Nothing criminal was ever filed, but the pattern was clear. Margaret has a history of using her position to benefit herself and her family. Mrs. Rodriguez, our retired CPA neighbor, offered to help analyze the HOA books. "I've seen this before," she said during our secret garage meeting. "Small-scale embezzlement, family business favoritism. It's more common than you'd think in HOAs." But here's where the story takes a turn that even I didn't see coming. My grandfather's estate attorney calls with an update on the mineral rights situation. Apparently, those old petroleum leases from the 1960s are suddenly extremely valuable again. New extraction techniques make previously uneconomical deposits profitable. "Ms. Thompson, your grandfather's mineral rights are worth approximately $2.8 million in today's market." I'm holding the phone, staring at Luna, who's chasing her tail in the backyard, and suddenly realizing that I have enough money to solve this problem permanently. Not just pay Margaret's ridiculous fines, but buy my way out of this nightmare entirely. Or, better yet, use that leverage to solve the problem for everyone. That night, I started researching property acquisition law and HOA dissolution procedures, because if Margaret wanted to play hardball, I was about to show her what a real power move looked like. Here's your second knowledge nugget. Always request HOA financial records annually. Embezzlement is surprisingly common, and boards must provide documentation by law. Most criminals count on homeowners never asking to see the books. Luna sensed something was different. Her anxiety was completely gone now, replaced by this confident swagger that matched my own growing determination. We weren't just defending ourselves anymore, we were going on the offensive. Margaret went nuclear. The sheriff's notice was taped to my front door like a scarlet letter. Formal foreclosure proceedings for $4,200 in accumulated fines. 75 days to pay up or lose my house. The auction was scheduled for April 18th, and Margaret had already started spreading word that the problem neighbor would finally be gone. I'm not ashamed to admit I cried holding those papers. The rough texture of that legal document felt like sandpaper against my fingers, and the salt taste of tears mixed with the bitter reality that Margaret might actually win. For about 15 minutes, I seriously considered surrendering Luna to save the house. The thought of her back in the shelter, confused and abandoned again, nearly destroyed me. But then she walked over and placed her head on my lap like she was saying, "We're in this together, remember?" That's when I stopped being the victim and started being the villain in Margaret's story. First move, I hired a private investigator. Turns out Jennifer Walsh specialized in HOA fraud cases and had some very interesting insights about Margaret's background. 4 days later, she called with information that made my blood run cold. Margaret wasn't just corrupt. She was systematic about it. "Your HOA chairwoman was terminated from Regional Trust Bank for approving loans to family members without proper documentation," Jennifer explained. "She's been targeting single women and minorities in Copper Ridge since day one. You're just the latest in a pattern." The evidence was damning. Over 4 years, Margaret had initiated foreclosure proceedings against 9 homeowners. 6 were single women. 1 was an elderly Latino gentleman who barely spoke English. 2 were young families with small children. All of them had been forced to sell their homes at below-market prices to avoid the embarrassment of foreclosure. All of those sales went to the same buyer, Caldwell Development Group, Margaret's family business. But here's the revelation that changed everything. My grandfather's mineral rights weren't just valuable, they were strategic. The inheritance paperwork revealed that Grandpa Frank's petroleum leases extended under the entire Copper Ridge development. The original developer had never purchased the subsurface rights because they were worthless in 2020. $2.8 million in mineral rights under Margaret's precious development, including under her house. The attorney handling the estate laughed when I asked about my options. Ms. Thompson, you could legally force access to your mineral rights through eminent domain, or you could lease extraction rights to the highest bidder. Either way, you've got leverage that makes their foreclosure threat look like a parking ticket. That weekend, the Copper Ridge Underground held its largest meeting yet in Steve's garage. 28 neighbors crammed in between his paramedic equipment and old holiday decorations, everyone sharing their Margaret horror stories in hushed voices. She tried to fine me for letting my teenage daughter practice violin after 5 p.m., whispered Sandra from the end of the street. Said it was disturbing the neighborhood tranquility. My dad got a violation notice for his mobility scooter being visually disruptive to the neighborhood aesthetic, added Carlos, whose elderly father lived with him. We had to hire an attorney just to keep helping him get around his own property. Pattern recognition kicked in. Margaret wasn't just power-hungry. She was discriminatory. Every target fit the same profile: vulnerable residents who couldn't afford to fight back. Until now, Mrs. Rodriguez had been analyzing the HOA financial records with the intensity of a forensic accountant. The money trail is clear, she announced. Margaret's been artificially inflating maintenance costs and funneling the excess to family businesses. We're talking about organized fraud. Steve nodded grimly. In emergency services, we'd call this arson, burning down the community from the inside. That's when I realized the scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just about saving my house anymore. This was about stopping a predator who'd been systematically targeting vulnerable neighbors for years. The foreclosure papers sat on my kitchen counter like a challenge. Margaret thought she was forcing me out, but she'd actually given me the perfect opportunity to expose her entire operation. Mike, Rebecca's journalist ex-husband, had been quietly investigating other Caldwell development projects. His findings were explosive. Margaret's family had pulled the same scam in 4 other developments over the past decade. Manufactured HOA violations, targeted harassment, forced sales, family business acquisitions. A criminal enterprise disguised as suburban governance. Here's your third knowledge nugget. Foreclosure for HOA fines require specific legal procedures. Many HOAs skip steps, making their actions invalid and potentially criminal. Always demand they follow due process to the letter. I made my decision that night sitting on my back deck with Luna sprawled across my feet. The sound of distant freeway traffic mixed with the gentle hum of neighborhood air conditioners, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Complete calm. Margaret thought she was destroying my life. Instead, she'd given me everything. I needed to destroy hers. The smoking gun came from the most unexpected place, a dusty filing cabinet in the back of the county clerk's office. I'd been digging through the original Copper Ridge development contracts, looking for any loopholes in the foreclosure proceedings, when I found something that made my hands shake. Buried in the fine print of a 58-page document was a clause that changed everything. Right of first refusal on all property sales shall be retained by Caldwell Development Group LLC for a period of 12 years from initial purchase. Caldwell Development Group, Margaret's family company. My brain started connecting dots at lightning speed. Every foreclosure in Copper Ridge, every forced sale to avoid embarrassment, every below-market transaction, they all went to the same buyer because Margaret's family had a legal right to swoop in and purchase any home that went up for sale. But that wasn't the worst part. Jennifer, my private investigator, had been tracing email communications through some creative public records requests. What she found was a digital paper trail that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. Email chain between Margaret and her nephew, Derek, current CEO of Caldwell Development. The Thompson property acquisition timeline needs to be accelerated. Priority removal before spring market opens. What about the elderly Asian woman on Cedar Street? Mom said she's been asking questions about the landscaping contracts, already initiated proceedings, garden statute violations. Plus her English is limited enough that she won't contest the legal fees. Perfect. That gives us the corner lot for the expansion project. They weren't just collecting fines. They were systematically driving down property values to force sales, then buying homes at below market rates for redevelopment. It was gentrification with a gavel and a clipboard. The real estate manipulation went back to day one. Margaret had been targeting undesirable residents from the moment she became HOA chairwoman. Single women who couldn't afford legal fights, elderly immigrants who didn't understand their rights, families with children who made noise. My name was on their acquisition list before I'd even moved in. This realization shifted the entire power dynamic. I wasn't a victim. I was a target in a calculated scheme to steal people's homes. And Margaret had no idea that her latest mark was sitting on $2.8 million in mineral rights that extended under her precious development. The mineral rights weren't just valuable, they were leverage. Every lot in Copper Ridge sat on top of petroleum deposits that my grandfather had owned since 1962. The surface developers in 2020 never bothered to check who owned what was underneath their expensive houses. Legal research confirmed what I'd suspected. Mineral rights trump surface rights in Arizona. I could literally force access to my property through any lot in the development, or I could lease extraction rights to an oil company and let them handle the logistics. Either way, Margaret's real estate empire was built on land she didn't actually control, but the emotional impact hit harder than the legal implications. Luna's barking hadn't been the problem. I'd been the problem. My existence as a single woman with a rescue dog threatened their carefully orchestrated neighborhood aesthetic. I was never going to be allowed to stay no matter how quiet Luna became. The foreclosure papers suddenly looked different. Not like a punishment for violations, but like an eviction notice from people who'd been planning to steal my home from the beginning. That night, I sat in my kitchen reading through every email, every financial record, every piece of evidence that Jennifer had uncovered. Luna curled up at my feet, completely relaxed for the first time since we'd moved to Copper Ridge. She could sense that something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't fighting to keep my place in their neighborhood anymore. I was fighting to take their neighborhood away from them. The irony was beautiful. Margaret thought she was eliminating a problem resident. Instead, she'd declared war on someone with the resources and motivation to burn her entire criminal enterprise to the ground. War requires strategy, and strategy requires the right team. Steve brought tactical planning skills from 25 years of emergency services and intimate knowledge of every neighbor's grievances. Rebecca's ex-husband, Mike, had media connections and investigative experience to turn our evidence into front-page news. Mrs. Rodriguez wielded spreadsheets like weapons and could trace financial fraud through a maze of shell companies. My private investigator, Jennifer, became our intelligence officer, continuing to dig into the Caldwell family business empire while I focused on the legal strategy. The first planning session happened in my living room at 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday. The stakes drawn, speaking in hushed tones like we were plotting a heist. In a way, we were, except we were stealing back what had been taken from an entire community. Here's what we know, I said, spreading documents across my coffee table. Margaret's family has pulled this scam in 5 developments over 12 years. They manufacture HOA violations, force below-market sales, then redevelop the properties for massive profits. Mrs. Rodriguez had her laptop open, fingers flying across the keyboard. The financial trail shows $3.2 million in suspicious HOA transactions across all their properties. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. Mike leaned forward, journalist instincts engaged. The story writes itself. Local HOA chairwoman runs real estate fraud scheme. But we need the confrontation to be public. Cameras rolling, witnesses present, undeniable evidence. That's when I dropped the bombshell about my inheritance. $2.8 million in mineral rights under the entire development, I announced, which means I have leverage they can't imagine. Steve whistled. Oh, you could buy your way out of this whole mess. I could, I agreed. Or I could buy my way into an even bigger mess for them. The brilliant pivot came from Mrs. Rodriguez. Instead of trying to purchase individual homes, which would cost nearly $15 million for a controlling interest, we could target the HOA's assets directly. The HOA owns 45% of the total development land, she explained, pulling up property records. Common areas, undeveloped lots, the community center. If you control the HOA assets, you control the neighborhood. My Legal research confirmed the strategy. In Arizona, you can dissolve an HOA if you own 51% of the total property. But that included common areas and undeveloped land, not just individual houses. The smell of fresh coffee and the sound of calculator keys clicking became the soundtrack to our late-night strategy sessions. We mapped out every angle: legal, financial, public relations, and emotional. Mike would prepare a comprehensive exposé on HOA corruption for release during the public confrontation. His editor had already approved the story based on our preliminary evidence. Steve coordinated the neighborhood response. The Copper Ridge Underground now included 37 of 53 households ready to speak publicly about Margaret's abuse of power. Mrs. Rodriguez tracked the money, building an airtight case for criminal charges that would land Margaret in actual prison, not just civil court. And I was going to use my grandfather's petroleum money to turn Copper Ridge into exactly the kind of place Margaret hated most. A community where rescue dogs could run free and single women didn't have to hide their garden decorations. The dog park vision evolved during those planning sessions. 18 acres of former restricted common areas converted into a sanctuary for rescue animals, educational programs for dog training and trauma recovery, a community center where neighbors could gather without fear of violating some arbitrary rule. But first we had to survive the foreclosure. My attorney, a sharp property lawyer with oil and gas experience, walked me through the acquisition strategy. The mineral rights gave me multiple options. I could force surface access through eminent domain, lease extraction rights to create ongoing revenue, or use the threat of industrial activity to negotiate favorable terms. The legal precedent is clear, he explained. Mineral rights holders can access their property through any surface point necessary. If that means drilling in their backyard, that's their problem. Margaret had no idea what was coming. She was still playing neighborhood politics while I was preparing to deploy weapons-grade capitalism. The technical preparation was extensive. Geological surveys confirmed valuable deposits under 49 of the 53 lots. Legal precedent. Research showed dozens of cases where mineral rights trumped HOA restrictions. Financial analysis proved the economics would work, even if I had to buy out every family that wanted to leave. 3 knowledge nuggets emerged from our research that every homeowner should know. First, mineral rights often trump surface property rights. Check your deed for subsurface ownership, because someone else might legally control what's under your house. Second, HOAs can be dissolved if 51% of property owners vote to terminate, but common area ownership complicates the process and creates opportunities for creative solutions. Third, always document harassment patterns. Courts take systematic targeting seriously, especially when it affects protected classes. The countdown to confrontation had begun. Margaret was accelerating her foreclosure timeline, probably sensing that I was up to something but unable to imagine the scope of what was coming. In 3 weeks, we'd face off at the monthly HOA meeting. Margaret thought she was finally getting rid of her problem resident. She had no idea she was about to lose everything. Margaret was getting desperate, and desperate people make catastrophic mistakes. The rumor campaign started on a Monday. Suddenly, neighbors were receiving calls about how I was planning to bring in drilling equipment that would destroy property values. Margaret was telling anyone who'd listen that I was some kind of environmental terrorist who wanted to turn Copper Ridge into an industrial wasteland. She called an emergency HOA board meeting to pass new bylaws prohibiting industrial activities on residential property. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. The woman who'd been running an illegal real estate scam was suddenly concerned about protecting the community, but Margaret's biggest mistake was sending her husband to try to buy me off. Richard Caldwell showed up at my door on a Wednesday evening, wearing his expensive suit and that patronizing smile that runs in the family. The smell of his cheap cologne mixed with nervous sweat announced his desperation before he even opened his mouth. "Emma, we'd like to make you a generous offer," he said, pulling out a folded check. $550,000 for your house. That's $80,000 over market value, and you won't have to deal with any of this foreclosure nonsense. I looked at the check, then at him, then back at the check. "That's very generous, Richard. What's the catch?" "No catch. Just a standard NDA to protect everyone's privacy during the transition." An NDA. They wanted to pay me to shut up about their criminal enterprise. I'll think about it, I lied, already planning how to use this attempted bribery as evidence. While Margaret was running her smear campaign above ground, I was building my empire below ground. Literally. Turns out most of my neighbors had no idea what mineral rights were worth when I started quietly approaching them with offers to purchase their subsurface rights for $7,500 each. Money they never knew they had. Most jumped at the chance. "It's just what's under the dirt, right?" laughed Bob from 4 houses down. "Hell, I'll sell you whatever's down there for $7,000. Probably just rocks and worms anyway." By the end of the week, I owned mineral rights under 38 of the 53 properties in Copper Ridge, which meant I could legally access my petroleum deposits through 3/4 of the neighborhood. Jennifer, my private investigator, hit the mother lode during this period. Her deep dive into the Caldwell family business revealed they'd pulled this exact scam in 4 other developments, following the same playbook: target vulnerable residents, manufacture violations, force sales, acquire properties, redevelop for profit. The evidence file was getting thick enough to use as a doorstop. Bank records, email communications, property transfer documents, testimony from previous victims. Margaret's entire criminal enterprise was documented in beautiful, prosecutable detail. But the revelation that really got my blood pumping happened on Friday afternoon. Anonymous flyers started appearing in mailboxes detailing Margaret's financial irregularities and questionable business practices. Someone was spreading word about missing HOA funds and suspicious family business contracts. Margaret went door to door, trying to collect the flyers, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. By Saturday morning, the entire neighborhood was buzzing with questions about their HOA chairwoman's integrity. Her support base started cracking. Board members who'd rubber-stamped her decisions for years suddenly wanted to see documentation. Neighbors who'd been afraid to speak up found courage in numbers. Margaret's response was to escalate the psychological warfare. She created fake social media accounts to attack my character, claiming I was unstable and dangerous to community children. She started a petition to ban Luna from the neighborhood, calling her a vicious animal that posed a threat to everyone's safety. The woman was so desperate she was fighting a war against a chocolate Labrador. Meanwhile, I was conducting my own psychological operations. I hired a legitimate surveying crew to mark the exact boundaries of my mineral rights around the development. Every morning, Margaret would peek through her blinds to see more stakes going up, marking territory that technically belonged to me. The sound of those survey stakes being driven into the ground became the soundtrack to Margaret's mounting panic. Each thunk of the hammer was a reminder that her perfect little kingdom was built on land she didn't actually control. Luna had transformed completely during this period. Her anxiety was ancient history, replaced by a confident swagger that made her the neighborhood favorite. Kids would run up to pet her. Other dogs would play with her at the park. Even the elderly residents would smile when they saw her coming. She'd become a symbol of the positive change coming to Copper Ridge, while Margaret had become a symbol of everything toxic about power-hungry HOA boards. The foreclosure hearing was still scheduled for next week, but Margaret didn't realize she was walking into a trap. She thought she was finally getting rid of her problem resident. She had no idea that her problem resident was about to become her landlord. Margaret's final desperate move was calling an emergency HOA meeting to vote me out of the neighborhood entirely. The email went out to all residents on a Friday afternoon. Emergency. Community Standards Meeting. Monday 6:30 p.m. Community Center. Agenda. Resolution to remove resident in violation of community harmony standards. She was invoking a clause buried deep in the HOA bylaws that allowed for immediate eviction of residents who posed a fundamental threat to neighborhood character. It was the nuclear option, and she was betting that fear would drive enough neighbors to her side. I let her think she was winning. All weekend I played the part of the panicked resident, made a few strategic phone calls where I sounded desperate and defeated. Let it slip to the right neighbors that I was scrambling to find an attorney and didn't know how to fight back. Margaret was so confident that she started shopping for champagne to celebrate my departure. Meanwhile, Mike had his camera, crew ready to roll, The local news station was sending a reporter to cover what they thought was a routine HOA meeting. Social media campaigns were locked and loaded, waiting for the perfect moment to launch. My legal documents had been finalized that very morning. The purchase of all HOA common areas was complete. 18 acres of parks, playgrounds, and undeveloped land now belonged to me. Margaret had no idea that while she was planning to kick me out of my house, I'd just bought the neighborhood. The mineral rights consolidation had reached critical mass. 38 properties worth of subsurface access gave me legal control over 3/4 of Copper Ridge's underground. The geological survey confirmed deposits worth $2.8 million in current market conditions. Monday evening arrived with the kind of dramatic tension you usually only see in movies. The community center was packed with over 70 residents, plus news cameras, plus a few unexpected guests that Margaret definitely wasn't expecting. The Copper Ridge Underground had mobilized everyone. People were standing along the walls, sitting on the floor, crowding around doorways. Margaret arrived fashionably late, wearing expensive new jewelry that probably came from embezzled HOA funds. The sound of her heels clicking across the community center floor was like a funeral march. She just didn't realize she was the one marching to her doom. She called the meeting to order with that smug confidence that comes from thinking you hold all the cards. "We're here tonight to address a serious threat to our community standards," Margaret announced, her voice carrying that same condescending tone I'd heard 9 months ago. "Certain residents have shown a complete disregard for the rules that make Copper Ridge the premier neighborhood it is today." The crowd was restless, neighbors shifting in their seats, whispering among themselves, looking between Margaret and me like they were watching a tennis match. "The board has voted to invoke the Community Harmony Standards Clause," Margaret continued, "to remove the resident whose dog barking, property violations, and general disrespect for authority has made it impossible for the rest of us to enjoy our homes." That's when I stood up, Luna by my side, and delivered my opening salvo. "Before we vote on anything, Margaret, I'd like to share some information about how our HOA finances have been managed." Margaret tried to shut me down. "You're out of order. This meeting is about your violations, not the $63,000 in missing funds." I continued, projecting my voice to the back of the room. "The no-bid contracts to your brother-in-law's landscaping company, the foreclosure proceedings designed to force below-market sales to your family's development business." The room exploded. Neighbors shouting questions, demanding answers, voices rising in anger and confusion. Margaret was frantically banging her gavel, trying to restore order, but the damage was done. I had their attention, and I wasn't finished. "Margaret, you want to talk about community standards? Let's talk about the email where you called Mrs. Rodriguez's English limited enough that she won't contest the legal fees. Let's talk about targeting single women and elderly residents for manufactured violations." Mike was getting every word, on camera. The news reporter was scribbling notes furiously. Margaret's face was cycling through shades of white that would make a paint store jealous. "This is slander," Margaret screamed. "Security, remove this woman." But there was no security. Just 70 angry neighbors who were finally hearing the truth about their HOA chairwoman's criminal enterprise. That's when I played my ace card. "Oh, and Margaret, about those foreclosure proceedings you're so excited about." I pulled out the deed paperwork with a flourish. "I bought all the HOA common areas this morning with my inheritance from Grandpa's oil wells." The silence was deafening. You could hear a pin drop if pins made the same sound as Margaret's jaw hitting the floor. "Which means," I continued with a smile, "I own the parks, the playgrounds, and all the undeveloped land you've been using to threaten people. I also own mineral rights under 38 of your properties." Luna barked once, perfectly timed, and the crowd erupted in laughter and applause. Margaret's face went through more color changes than a mood ring having an existential crisis. That's impossible," she stammered, papers rustling frantically as she searched through HOA bylaws like they might magically contain a clause about mineral rights. "You can't just buy—" "Actually, I can," I said, holding up the official deed. "Transfer documents." And I did, this morning. All perfectly legal, all properly filed with the county clerk. The community center was electric with tension. 70 neighbors holding their breath, news cameras capturing every moment, and Margaret Caldwell realizing that her carefully constructed empire was crumbling in real time. Before anyone votes on anything, I continued, I think we should hear from some other people who have experience with Margaret's community standards. That's when the cavalry arrived. Sandra Martinez stepped up first. Margaret Caldwell fined my family $900 for letting our teenage daughter practice violin in our own home after 5 p.m. When we couldn't pay immediately, she started foreclosure proceedings. Carlos Kim was next. She tried to fine my elderly father for his mobility scooter being visually disruptive. We had to hire an attorney just to keep helping Dad get around his own house. One by one, neighbors stood up to share their stories. The room filled with testimonies of harassment, discrimination, and abuse of power that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning 4 years. Margaret tried desperately to regain control. These are all lies, coordinated attacks by disgruntled residents who don't want to follow simple rules. Simple rules? Steve stood up, his paramedic's voice carrying authority. Like the military flag height requirement that doesn't exist in our bylaws, the garden statue ban you invented, the quiet hours that somehow only apply to families with children. Mrs. Rodriguez opened her laptop and projected the HOA financial records onto the community center screen. Missing funds, $63,000. Unauthorized payments to family businesses, $89,000. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. Margaret's husband Richard tried to sneak toward the exit, but Mike's camera operator was positioned perfectly to catch him attempting to flee. The visual of a city zoning commissioner running away from questions about his wife's corruption was going to make excellent television. Margaret, I said, walking closer to her table with Luna at my side. You want to talk about threats to community standards? Let's talk about using your position to steal people's homes. I produced the smoking gun, printed emails between Margaret and her nephew Derek discussing priority removal targets and acquisition timelines. The Thompson property acquisition needs to be accelerated, I read aloud. Priority removal before spring market opens. That's me, Margaret. You weren't enforcing rules. You were stealing my house. The room erupted again, neighbors shouting, questions, demanding explanations, voices rising in righteous anger. Margaret's remaining supporters were melting away faster than ice cream in August. That's when law enforcement made their entrance. Detective Williams from the Financial Crimes Unit had been quietly investigating HOA fraud cases across the county. Our evidence had given him everything he needed for arrests. Bank examiner Patricia Gomez was right behind him, carrying official documents that would freeze all Caldwell family business accounts pending investigation. Margaret saw the badges and panicked. "This is a witch hunt," she screamed, pointing at me like I was personally responsible for gravity. "She's the criminal here, threatening to drill oil wells in a residential neighborhood." And that's when I delivered the mic drop moment that would become neighborhood legend. "Actually, Margaret, about those oil wells," I smiled, pulling out one final document. "I don't need to drill anything. I'm turning this entire place into what you hate most, a community where rescue dogs can run free." The crowd went silent, waiting for the punchline. "I'm converting all the common areas into copper, Ridge Dog Sanctuary. 18 acres of off-leash paradise, complete with training programs for rescue animals and therapy programs for trauma survivors like Luna here." Luna wagged her tail so hard it sounded like applause. "Property values going down?" I continued. "Actually, they'll probably go up. Dog-friendly communities are highly sought after by young families. Progressive neighborhoods with cooperative governance instead of dictatorial HOAs are the future of suburban living." The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous ovation. 70 neighbors standing and cheering, children laughing, dogs barking happily outside where they'd heard the commotion. Margaret made one last desperate attempt to save face. She tried to run, but her designer heels betrayed her on the community center steps. The sound of those stilettos breaking was the perfect metaphor for her shattered authority. Detective Williams caught up with her in the parking lot, news cameras rolling as he read her rights for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit real estate theft. The last image of Margaret Caldwell as HOA chairwoman was her being loaded into a police car while Luna and 52 rescue dogs played freely in what used to be her restricted common areas. Justice served with a side of cosmic irony. 8 months later, Copper Ridge looks like a completely different place. The grand opening of Copper Ridge Dog Sanctuary was everything I dreamed of and more. 18 acres of former restricted areas now filled with the happy chaos of rescue dogs learning to trust humans again. Luna leads the pack as our unofficial ambassador, her transformation from anxious shelter dog to confident therapy animal inspiring everyone who meets her. Margaret Caldwell. She's serving 4 years in state prison for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. The judge was particularly unimpressed with her systematic targeting of vulnerable residents. Her husband Richard lost his position on the city zoning commission, and their house, ironically, was sold at below market value to pay restitution to her victims. The court-ordered community service was my personal favorite touch. 300 hours of cleaning up after dogs at the sanctuary she tried to destroy. There's something beautifully poetic about watching someone who spent years terrorizing pet owners scooping waste in a designer pantsuit covered in chocolate Labrador fur.